Have you ever heard your stomach growl while your heart quietly breaks? The sound of emptiness echoing louder than any thunder you've ever known? That night, I did. It was a cold December evening, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes every breath feel like a punishment. And I lay on the thin mattress in our small, dimly lit room, listening to my daughter's soft breathing beside me. The house was silent except for that faint, rhythmic sound, a reminder that she was warm, safe, and full, because I had made sure of it, even if it meant that I wouldn't be. The hunger twisted in my stomach like a restless animal, gnawing at me, but I forced myself to stay still, afraid that even the smallest movement might wake her and make her see the truth I was trying so hard to hide. The air inside the room was heavy with the faint scent of boiled soup, a cheap kind made from nothing but water, a single potato, and a pinch of salt that I'd pretended was enough for both of us. The bowl still sat on the counter, its surface now crusted and cold, and though it wasn't much, it had been everything we had that night. I'd ladled it carefully into her bowl, pretending to take mine later, telling her that fathers eat after their daughters, that this was what grown men do. She smiled with that innocence that could melt the hardest heart, believed every word, and ate quietly, her little fingers gripping the spoon as though she was afraid it might slip away. I watched her finish, my throat tight, my chest aching, and when she asked if I was full, I nodded, swallowing the lie like a mouthful of stones. When she fell asleep, I sat for hours beside her bed, listening to the wind outside, trying to ignore the hollow ache that spread from my stomach to my soul. I thought of how love is measured not by what we give, but by what we give up. And that night I gave up the simplest of things, a meal, so she could sleep without hunger. My hands trembled slightly as I tucked the blanket around her small frame, the flickering light from the single candle throwing her face into gentle relief. Her cheeks were round and peaceful, her lips slightly parted, and I couldn't help but smile despite the pain curling inside me. She looked like her mother when she slept, and for a fleeting second, I allowed myself to imagine that everything was still as it used to be, before life decided to take more than I could bear to lose. There was a time when nights like this were filled with laughter and the smell of roasted chicken, when the table was full and my daughter would sit between me and her mother, her hair tied in messy braids, talking endlessly about the things she learned in school. I used to come home tired from work, my hands calloused and my back aching, but the moment I walked through that door and saw them, all the exhaustion disappeared. I would set my lunchbox on the counter, kiss my wife's forehead, lift my daughter in my arms, and think to myself that no man alive could ever be as lucky as I was. I thought we had everything we needed: love, food, laughter, and maybe we did. But I didn't realize then how fragile all of it was, how quickly comfort could turn into struggle, and how fast a man could go from being a provider to a beggar in his own home. As I lay there that night, staring at the cracked ceiling, I could still hear echoes of those better days in my mind, laughter bouncing off the walls that were now too quiet, too empty. I tried to pretend that this hunger was temporary, that things would turn around soon, but deep down I knew it wasn't just food I was missing. It was dignity, purpose, and hope. Hunger does something to a man's pride. It strips you down to your bones, makes you question your worth, and reminds you how fragile survival really is. Every rumble in my stomach felt like an accusation, a cruel whisper telling me that I had failed, not just as a man, but as a father. I turned my head toward her again, watched the rise and fall of her chest under the blanket, and whispered a silent apology to no one but the darkness around me. I had promised her that I would always protect her, that she would never have to face the kind of pain I once knew growing up. Yet here we were, me lying hungry, and her blissfully unaware of the sacrifices being made for her innocence to remain untouched. There was a beauty in that ignorance, but also a sharp ache in knowing it couldn't last forever. Someday she would understand, and I prayed that when she did, she wouldn't see me as weak, but as a man who gave everything he had left, even his own comfort, to make sure she never went to bed with an empty stomach. The candle had almost burned out by the time I finally sat up, unable to sleep. The shadows on the walls looked longer than they should have, stretching like old memories trying to reach for me. I walked to the window, rubbing my arms to fight off the cold, and stared out at the street below. The world outside didn't care about our hunger. Cars still passed, lights still shone in distant windows, and somewhere out there people were sitting around tables, laughing and eating like life was normal. I envied them, but not with bitterness, more with a quiet yearning, a wish to return to the simplicity of having enough. I leaned my forehead against the cold glass, my reflection faintly visible, tired eyes staring back at me. I thought of my late wife again, of how she used to hum softly while cooking, of how she believed that no matter how hard life became, we would always find a way through. Her faith was like sunlight, always warm, always sure, and I wondered what she would think of me now. Hungry, jobless, lost. I whispered her name like a prayer, asking for strength, for guidance, for something, anything, to change. But all I got in return was silence, and the soft creak of the floorboards as I turned back toward my daughter. I sat beside her again, running my fingers through her hair, and in that moment I promised myself that no matter how bad things got, I would never let her go hungry, even if it meant starving 1,000 times over. I would find a way, even if I had to crawl through every rejection and failure to do it. Because that's what fathers do. They endure. The night stretched on, long and unforgiving, and though exhaustion pressed heavy on my eyelids, my mind refused to rest. Hunger doesn't let you sleep easily. It keeps you half awake, half dreaming, floating between hope and despair. I tried counting the cracks on the ceiling, tried to ignore the hollow burn in my gut, but even as I drifted close to sleep, I could feel the ache like a ghost inside me. Just before I finally slipped into a shallow rest, I heard her shift in her sleep, mumbling softly, her voice fragile but filled with warmth as she whispered, "Daddy." It was a sound so pure it broke me in the quietest way possible. I smiled, even as a tear slipped down my cheek, because in that single word was every reason I had to keep going. I thought that night would be just another battle against hunger, just another night to survive before facing another day of struggle, but I was wrong. Something was about to happen, something I couldn't have seen coming, something that would turn our lives in a direction I never imagined possible. But that night, something happened that changed everything. It's strange how you never notice the last day of peace until it's gone. You live it like any other day, routine, familiar, safe, never realizing that somewhere inside that day hides a quiet ending, one that will take everything you thought you could rely on. I still remember that day vividly, not because it was remarkable, but because it was perfectly ordinary. The sun filtered through the kitchen window, warm and golden, spilling over the wooden table that had seen countless breakfasts. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air while my daughter sat across from me, her small hands clutching a crayon as she sketched on a torn sheet of paper. She said she was drawing our family, me, her, and her mom, smiling beneath a bright yellow sun. Her laughter filled the room, soft and unguarded, and for a moment I believed the world was exactly as it should be. Our house wasn't big, but it was full of warmth. The walls carried our laughter. The kitchen always smelled of something cooking, and even the worn-out couch by the window felt like a throne when my daughter climbed into my lap with her coloring books. I worked long hours, sometimes late into the night, but I never complained because every evening when I came home, she would run toward me, shouting, "Daddy!" like I was some kind of hero returning from a battle. And maybe, in her eyes, I was. She didn't see the tired lines on my face or the calluses on my hands. She just saw the man who could lift her into the air and make her laugh until she forgot about everything else. Those were the days when life still made sense. I'd wake up to her tiny footsteps padding into my room, her voice whispering for me to get up because breakfast was ready, even though she could only manage to pour cereal into a bowl and drown it in milk. I'd act surprised every single time, pretending it was the best breakfast I'd ever had, and she'd beam with pride, completely unaware that her simple gesture meant more to me than any grand meal could. She was my reminder that happiness didn't have to be expensive. It just had to be real. After her mother passed away, it was just the two of us. I had promised myself that I would give her the kind of life she deserved, the kind her mother would have wanted for her. I took on extra shifts, stayed late at work, learned how to braid her hair, how to pack her school lunch, how to be both father and mother without letting her see how heavy that truly was. She made it easier somehow. She never complained when I was late or when we couldn't afford the things other kids had. She'd just hold my hand, tell me she didn't need anything else because she already had the best daddy in the world. That was her line. And every time she said it, I'd smile and thank her, pretending that I wasn't terrified of failing her one day. We had our small rituals. Friday nights were movie nights. We'd make popcorn and sit on the couch with a blanket wrapped around us, watching her favorite old cartoons. Saturday mornings, I'd take her to the park where she'd chase pigeons, her laughter echoing like music, and I'd sit on the bench thinking about how lucky I was to have her. Even on the toughest days, when bills stacked up and the world felt unfair, her smile was enough to make everything bearable. I didn't realize how much I depended on that smile until the day I almost lost it. That morning started like every other. I left early for work, kissed her forehead as she slept, and whispered the same promise I always did. Daddy will be home soon. I worked as a machine operator in a small manufacturing plant outside the city. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it paid enough to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. The people there were like family. We shared lunch breaks, joked about the boss, and counted down the days to payday like kids waiting for Christmas. It felt safe, steady, predictable, until it wasn't. I remember the phone call that came late that afternoon. The manager asked me to come into his office, his voice lower than usual. The walk down that hallway felt longer than it ever had before, every step echoing in my chest. When I opened the door, he didn't look me in the eyes. There was a letter on the desk already waiting, and before he even said a word, I knew what it was. I'd seen that envelope before, handed to men who left the factory floor with their heads down and their futures uncertain. Budget cuts, he said, like those two words could explain the panic that began to claw its way through me. He said it wasn't personal, that I'd been one of the best workers they had, that they just couldn't afford to keep everyone. His voice was kind, almost rehearsed, but I barely heard him. My mind was already at home, thinking about how I would explain this to my daughter, how I could keep the promise I'd made that morning. I took the letter, thanked him, though I don't know why, and walked out into the freezing air. The world looked the same. Cars still rushed by, the factory smoke still rose into the sky, but something inside me had shifted. I felt small, powerless, invisible. My fingers clenched around that envelope until it crumpled, my knuckles white from the grip. It wasn't just paper. It was everything. Our meals, our rent, her school supplies, our entire life, folded and sealed inside a single envelope that now felt like a sentence I couldn't escape. When I reached home, I tried to act normal. She ran to me, as always, arms outstretched, laughing, asking if we could go get ice cream. I smiled, forced the words out, told her maybe tomorrow, pretending the world hadn't just collapsed around me. She nodded, not disappointed, because she trusted that tomorrow always meant something better. I wished I could have believed that too. That night, after she went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the envelope. I tore it open slowly, as if dragging out the moment could somehow change what was written inside. The letter was short, cold, and final. My position had been terminated effective immediately. A check for my final wages was included, along with a polite line wishing me luck in my future endeavors. I ran my fingers over the paper, thinking of how quickly words can undo years of hard work. For a long time, I just sat there, the house quiet except for the ticking clock on the wall, the kind of silence that weighs heavier than noise ever could. I looked around at the small home we'd built together. The drawings she'd taped to the refrigerator, the toys scattered on the floor, the half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, and I realized how fragile everything truly was. All the laughter, all the warmth, all the stability we'd clung to rested on something as uncertain as a paycheck. I had always believed that if I worked hard enough, we would be safe. But sitting there under the dim kitchen light, I understood for the first time that safety was an illusion, one that could vanish the moment someone else decided it was no longer affordable. I folded the letter and slipped it into the drawer beside me, telling myself that I'd find a way out, that I'd get another job before things got bad, that she would never have to know how scared I was. I looked toward her bedroom door, the faint glow of her nightlight spilling into the hallway, and whispered, "You'll never go hungry, sweetheart. I promise." I didn't know that pay envelope would be the last one for a long time. The night stretched thin and restless. I tried to sleep, but every creak in the house, every gust of wind against the window felt like a warning. Something inside me knew that a storm was coming, one I couldn't stop no matter how tightly I held on to hope. The next morning, everything I built started to crumble. The day I lost my job, I lost more than just money. I lost a piece of myself that I didn't know I'd never get back. It started like any other morning, the same routine that had kept my life stitched together for years. The alarm buzzed at 6, and I dragged myself out of bed, careful not to wake my daughter as she slept, curled under her blanket. I brewed my coffee, the smell filling the small kitchen with a warmth that always felt like hope. I remember sitting at that table, lacing up my boots, staring at the lunchbox I'd packed the night before. I didn't know it then, but that would be the last morning I'd ever take it to work. The sky was gray when I walked to the bus stop, the kind of gray that hangs low and feels heavy with warning. The streets were quiet except for the hum of traffic far away, and the air carried a chill that bit through my jacket. I remember thinking that maybe it would snow soon, and how my daughter would love that. She always got excited about the first snowfall, pressing her little hands against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she whispered wishes only she could hear. That thought made me smile, even as something inside me felt uneasy. At the factory, everything looked the same, but the air felt different. People spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the supervisor's office. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was just another rumor. There were always rumors about layoffs, and somehow I had always been spared. But that morning, when the intercom buzzed and my name was called, my stomach dropped. I walked toward the office, my boots echoing down the concrete hallway, the sound sharp and final. The manager sat behind his desk, his expression practiced, sympathetic but distant. I barely heard his words. Restructuring, downsizing, economic conditions. They all blended together into a blur of polite devastation. When he slid the envelope across the desk, my hands hesitated before taking it. I didn't want to touch it, as if leaving it there could make this not real. But reality doesn't care what you're ready for. I nodded when he finished speaking, though I don't remember what I agreed to. My throat burned. My heart felt like it was folding in on itself. I had given that place everything. Years of sweat, missed dinners, birthdays spent under flickering lights surrounded by machines that didn't care if I was tired or lonely. And in the end, all it took to erase me from that place was a few sentences and an envelope. I left the office in silence, avoiding the eyes of my coworkers. Some of them already knew. A few offered, awkward nods or murmured, "Sorry, man." But most just kept working. I didn't blame them. In times like that, silence is safer than sympathy. When I stepped outside, the cold hit me harder than before. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the gray sky, the world spinning as if nothing had happened. Cars passed. A truck honked. Somewhere, a radio played a cheerful song. Everything kept moving, and I stood still, holding a letter that had just undone my entire life. The bus ride home felt endless. I sat by the window, watching the city pass by like a blur of colors and faces. Every stop felt like a reminder of how small I was compared to the world. My reflection in the glass looked like a stranger. Tired. Beaten. Lost. I tried to think of what I'd tell my daughter. I pictured her running to me when I walked through the door, smiling, asking if we could stop for ice cream the way we always did on Fridays. I thought about how I would have to look into those bright eyes and tell her, "No, not tonight." When I finally reached home, the warmth that usually greeted me felt thinner, as if the house already knew something had changed. I opened the door, and there she was, sitting on the floor surrounded by her crayons, her hair a messy halo around her face. She looked up, smiling so brightly that for a second I forgot everything. "Daddy, can we go get ice cream? You promised," she said, her voice full of excitement. I forced a smile, tried to sound cheerful, but the words caught in my throat. "Maybe tomorrow, sweetheart. Daddy's tired tonight." She pouted for a second, but nodded. Always patient, always understanding in ways she shouldn't have to be. She went back to her drawings, humming softly, while I stood there watching her, feeling something heavy and invisible press down on my chest. I walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and stared at the few items left inside. A half-empty milk carton, a few eggs, and a loaf of bread that was more crust than anything else. I ran my hand over my face, the reality settling deeper with every breath. Tomorrow, I'd have to start looking for another job. Tomorrow, I'd have to start pretending everything was fine. But tonight, I just stood there, staring into that fridge as if an answer might suddenly appear between the shelves. That evening, we ate toast and scrambled eggs for dinner. She talked about school, about how her teacher said she was doing great in reading, and about how her friend Lily had invited her to a birthday party. I nodded, smiled, tried to keep the conversation light, but my mind was somewhere else. On rent, on bills, on the letter still folded in my pocket. Every time I looked at her, I saw the reason I couldn't afford to fall apart. She needed me to be strong, even when I didn't feel like I could be. After dinner, she showed me her latest drawing. A picture of us holding hands in front of our house. The words, "Me and Daddy," written in big, crooked letters. I told her it was perfect, and she beamed with pride, hugging me before running off to her room. I sat there at the table long after she'd gone to bed, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind brushing against the window. I took the letter from my pocket and unfolded it again, reading the same words I had already memorized, as if looking at them enough times would change what they meant. I tried to plan, to think of what to do next, but my mind was too crowded with fear. I thought of the rent due in 2 weeks, the electricity bill sitting unopened on the counter, the groceries that would need buying soon. I thought of the people I could ask for help, but didn't want to. Pride is a cruel thing. It starves you, but you still cling to it like armor. As the night deepened, the air in the house grew colder. I went to check on her before bed. She was fast asleep, her small hand clutching the corner of her blanket, her face peaceful in the dim light. I stood there, just watching her, feeling the ache of love and guilt tangled together. How could I tell her that everything was about to change? How could I let her know that the man she believed could fix anything had no idea how to fix this? I walked back to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and sat in the dark, thinking about the days ahead. I tried to convince myself it would be fine, that I'd find something soon, that I'd somehow keep the promises I'd made. But a voice inside me whispered otherwise. The kind of voice you can't silence no matter how hard you try. I knew I couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. She was too young to understand what it meant when a man loses his job, how quickly the world can tilt out of balance. She needed to believe everything was okay, and I needed to believe I could protect her from the truth, even if it was just for one more night. That night, I lied to her for the first time. Some lies are told not to deceive, but to protect. That's what I kept telling myself the night I first lied to my daughter, the night that felt heavier than hunger itself. It had been a long day of searching, walking from one place to another, asking if anyone was hiring, only to hear the same rehearsed words again and again. Sorry, not right now. My feet ached, my throat was dry, and the last few coins in my pocket weren't enough for even a cup of coffee. The cold was biting harder than usual when I finally came home. The house was dark except for the faint glow from the kitchen where my daughter sat, her legs swinging from the chair as she waited for me. She had tried to make dinner on her own. The smell of something burnt hit me before I even reached the doorway. On the table sat 2 small bowls, one with soup, thin and watery, and the other filled with what looked like overcooked rice. She looked up at me with that proud little smile of hers, the kind that could soften even the cruelest heart. "I made dinner, Daddy," she said, her voice full of triumph. "You said you like rice, so I made some." I felt something tighten in my chest as I walked closer, forcing a smile to mask the sting of tears that threatened to rise. The soup was barely more than warm water with a few floating pieces of onion, and the rice was clumped together, but to me, it looked like a feast. She had tried her best. I could see the effort in the way the table was set, her small hands having arranged everything carefully. The old spoon, the chipped plate, even a folded napkin she'd drawn a heart on. "You did amazing," I said softly, running a hand through her hair. She giggled, proud of herself, and handed me a bowl. "You eat first, Daddy," she insisted. "I already had some." For a moment, I froze. I could see right through her lie, the same kind of lie I was about to tell her. Her bowl was untouched, the spoon resting neatly beside it. She was waiting for me to eat, to see me full before she took a single bite. My throat tightened. I wanted to tell her no, that she should eat, that she needed it more than I did. But then I saw her eyes, bright and hopeful, watching me with the kind of faith that could break a man in half. I couldn't bear to take that away from her. So I nodded, smiled, and took the bowl she offered. I lifted the spoon, brought it to my lips, and let the thin, flavorless liquid touch my tongue. I swallowed, forcing myself to say, "Delicious." She grinned, relief flooding her little face, and only then did she begin to eat from her own bowl. But as I watched her, my appetite vanished completely. I set the spoon down, pretending I was already full, telling her I'd eaten something earlier. "At work," I said, the lie slipping out more easily than it should have. "Someone brought food, and I had a big lunch." Her smile grew wider, and she nodded happily. "That's good, Daddy. You work so hard. You need to eat." Her innocence cut through me like a blade. I looked at her. This small, fragile soul who trusted me completely, who believed every word I said. And I felt guilt crash over me in waves. How could something so pure live in a world that cruel? How could I let her grow up thinking everything was fine when I didn't know if I could keep the lights on another week? But in that moment, looking at her, I knew that lie wasn't born from deception. It was born from love. I sat there watching her eat slowly, humming a song her mother used to sing. My wife's voice echoed in my memory, soft and warm, filling the spaces in our home that now felt empty. It had been years since she passed, but sometimes I still caught myself turning toward the door, expecting her to walk through it, her laughter spilling into the room. She had been my anchor, my strength, and losing her had nearly destroyed me. The only reason I survived was sitting in front of me now, spooning rice into her mouth with all the seriousness of a grown-up, unaware that she was the reason I kept breathing when everything else in me wanted to stop. I remembered the night my wife died. The hospital room was cold, the machines beeping steadily as she lay there, her hand weak in mine. She had smiled at me, that same gentle smile that used to make the world feel lighter. "Promise me," she had whispered, her voice trembling. "Promise me you'll take care of her, no matter what." I had nodded, tears slipping down my face, and I meant it with every part of my soul. But sitting there now, hungry, tired, and defeated, I wondered if I was keeping that promise or failing it. The candle flickered on the table, its flame struggling against the faint draft from the window. My daughter looked so peaceful, so content just to share this moment with me. And I realized that hunger, real hunger, wasn't just about the emptiness in your stomach. It was about the ache of helplessness, the silent guilt that comes when you watch someone you love and know you can't give them everything they deserve. Hunger hurts, yes, but watching your child eat while you pretend you're not starving? That breaks something deeper. When she finished her meal, she yawned, wiped her mouth with the little napkin she'd folded, and came over to me. "You should rest, Daddy," she said softly, climbing onto my lap. She rested her head on my chest, her small heartbeat steady against mine. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling the warmth of her body against my cold, trembling hands. "I love you," she murmured sleepily, already drifting off. I kissed the top of her head and whispered back, "I love you more than you'll ever know." I sat there for a long time after she fell asleep in my arms. The candle burned low, and the shadows on the wall stretched longer, darker. I thought about the lie I'd just told her, and wondered if it made me a bad father or just a desperate one. Maybe both. But in that moment, I knew I'd do it again, if it meant she could sleep without worry, if it meant she could hold on to her innocence a little longer. As I carried her to bed, I whispered another promise into the night, one I wasn't sure I could keep. "You'll never go hungry, not while I'm alive." I tucked her in, brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, and stood there watching her. The house was silent except for her soft breathing. I should have felt peace, but instead, I felt the weight of the world pressing down on me. When I turned off the light and walked back to the kitchen, the darkness seemed thicker, heavier. I sat down, put my head in my hands, and let the silence swallow me. The hunger gnawed at my insides, but it wasn't just the lack of food. It was the fear of what was coming. The bills I couldn't pay, the jobs I couldn't find, the truth I couldn't tell her. I thought I could keep pretending, that if I smiled enough, if I kept lying, she'd never notice. But children have a way of seeing through the things you hide, of sensing the cracks you try so hard to cover. I didn't know it yet, but my lie wouldn't stay hidden for long. Because the next day, she saw the truth in my eyes. Sometimes, pride feeds the ego while the stomach stays empty. It's a strange kind of hunger, one that creeps into your soul and convinces you that suffering in silence is better than asking for help. That was the battle I fought every day after losing my job. Each morning I would wake up with the same heavy promise that I'd find something, anything, to put food on the table. And each night I would come home empty-handed, hiding the defeat behind a tired smile. The days started blending together, one gray hour spilling into the next. The air grew colder, sharper, and the city seemed to harden along with it. I walked for miles every day, boots worn thin, breath fogging in front of me as I knocked on doors and stopped at shops with faded "Help Wanted" signs that no one had bothered to take down. I'd step inside, hat in hand, and ask if they needed anyone, sweeping, cleaning, lifting, anything. Some people were kind enough to say they'd call if something opened up. Others just shook their heads and moved on with their day. Every rejection stung a little deeper, but I learned to swallow it. when the weather worsened, the cold began to feel like a second skin. The wind would cut through my coat as if it weren't even there, and I'd come home numb, fingers stiff and cracked, the ache in my bones deeper than the hunger in my stomach. My daughter would greet me at the door each evening, her little arms wrapping around my legs, her smile unshaken. "Did you find work today, Daddy?" she'd ask, her voice hopeful, her eyes bright. And I'd smile, brush her hair from her face and say, "Almost, sweetheart. Maybe tomorrow." She believed me, of course she did. Children always believe their fathers, until they can't anymore. Our neighbors started noticing. Mrs. Green from across the street, an elderly woman with kind eyes and too many cats, stopped by one afternoon with a casserole dish. "I made too much for myself," she said gently, holding it out to me. "You and your little girl could use it." For a moment, I wanted to take it. God, how I wanted to, but my pride stood taller than my hunger. I smiled, thanked her, and said, "That's kind of you, but we're fine. I've got dinner ready already." She hesitated, searching my face for a crack in the lie, but finally nodded. "All right, dear," she said, placing a hand on my arm. "You call me if you ever need anything." I promised I would, knowing full well I never would. When I closed the door, I leaned against it, the smell of her casserole still lingering in the air, rich and warm. My stomach twisted painfully, and I pressed a hand against it, hating myself for turning it away. But taking her food felt like admitting defeat, like confessing to the world that I couldn't provide for my daughter anymore. Pride, I learned, was heavier than any hunger. The bills began to pile up on the table, unopened. The refrigerator hummed quietly, almost mocking me with its emptiness. We were down to the last few cans of beans and a half loaf of stale bread. I tried stretching every meal as far as I could, a single potato divided between two plates, thin soup made to look full with too much water. My daughter never complained. She'd eat quietly, smiling through every meal as if she didn't notice. But I knew she did. Kids always know more than we give them credit for. To keep her spirits high, she started drawing. Every evening, after dinner, she'd sit by the window with her crayons, her tongue sticking out slightly as she concentrated. "What are you drawing today?" I'd ask, sitting beside her. She'd beam up at me and say, "Dinner for us. When you find work, we'll have pancakes and burgers and spaghetti every day." Then she'd hold up the paper proudly, colorful plates filled with foods we hadn't seen in weeks. I'd smile and nod, telling her it all looked delicious, while swallowing the lump in my throat. Sometimes, when she wasn't looking, I'd turn away and wipe my eyes before she could see the cracks in my strength. One night, after she had gone to bed, I sat by the kitchen window watching the snow fall. The city was silent, blanketed in white, and for a brief moment it looked peaceful, as if the world had paused to rest. But peace was a luxury I couldn't afford. I stared at my reflection in the glass. The tired eyes, the unshaven face, the man who looked far older than he was. I hardly recognized him. I thought about all the times I'd passed by people on the streets. Men sitting on corners with cardboard signs, women holding out cups, faces hollowed by life. I used to think I was different from them. I had a home, a job, a family. I had control. But now, looking at myself, I realized how thin that line really was. It doesn't take much to fall. One letter. One bad day. I considered asking for help more than once. There were food banks downtown, shelters, churches offering free meals. I knew about them. I even walked past one, stood outside for several minutes, watching people file in. But something stopped me from stepping through those doors. It wasn't shame, not exactly. It was the fear of what it would mean for her to see me that way. The image of her father standing in line for food like a beggar. I couldn't bear it. I wanted her to believe I was strong, that I could protect her. I wanted her to hold on to the illusion that her world was safe, even if mine was falling apart. But the truth was, I was exhausted. Every morning, I woke up with my heart heavy and my stomach empty. Every night, I went to bed with guilt gnawing at me like a living thing. My body was weak, but my pride wouldn't let me break. And yet, deep down, I knew it couldn't last. Forever. You can only lie to yourself for so long before reality starts whispering through the cracks. That whisper came one evening when I caught my daughter staring at me. I'd come home later than usual, pretending I'd been out looking for work. She was sitting on the couch, her drawing pad in her lap, but she wasn't coloring. She was just watching me quietly. "Are you okay, Daddy?" she asked. Her voice was soft, uncertain. I smiled, told her I was just tired, but the way she looked at me made my heart ache. She didn't believe me. Not completely. I could see it in her eyes, the same eyes that once only saw strength now beginning to sense the truth I was hiding. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat by her bedside for a long time. I listened to her breathing, watched the slow rise and fall of her chest, and wondered how long I could keep this up. The house was cold, and the sound of the wind outside was almost like a whisper telling me that my pride was killing us both. I wanted to pray, but the words wouldn't come. I thought of my wife again, of the promise I'd made to her. Take care of her, no matter what. What would she say if she saw me now? Would she tell me to swallow my pride, to ask for help, to stop pretending? Or would she understand that sometimes the only thing a man has left to protect is his dignity? When I finally lay down beside my daughter, the hunger clawed at me. But it wasn't the hunger that kept me awake. It was the weight of my choices, the fear that maybe my pride was doing more harm than good. The next morning I couldn't even pretend anymore. I never thought I'd beg. But hunger can make a man unrecognizable. It doesn't happen all at once. It creeps in quietly, stripping away pieces of your pride, your dignity, your self-worth, until all that's left is the raw, aching need to survive. I used to think begging was a choice, something people did when they gave up on trying. But I was wrong. When your child hasn't eaten properly in days, when you hear her stomach growl in the middle of the night, begging stops feeling like shame. It starts feeling like love in its most desperate form. The morning I decided to beg, the sky was the color of lead. The air carried that damp chill that settles deep in your bones, and the streets were half frozen from a night of sleet. I'd been walking for hours, my breath turning white in front of me, the ache in my stomach dull but constant. My hands were numb, my lips cracked, and I hadn't eaten anything since the day before. But what hurt the most wasn't my hunger. It was hers. My daughter had tried to hide it, smiling through her weakness, telling me she wasn't that hungry, that she'd eat later. But I saw it in her face, in the way her eyes lingered on the empty cupboards, and how her small hands rubbed her belly when she thought I wasn't looking. That morning, when she woke up, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Daddy, are we having breakfast?" she asked, her eyes full of hope, as if she already knew the answer but needed to hear something other than the truth. I smiled weakly, brushed her hair back, and said, "Of course, sweetheart. Daddy just needs to go out and get something. You rest, okay?" She nodded, too tired to question it, and I kissed her forehead before stepping outside. I told her I'd be back soon, but I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't come home empty-handed again. I walked through the town square, past the bakery that smelled of fresh bread and the diner where people sat with steaming plates of food, laughing as if hunger was something that only happened to others. I wanted to hate them, but I couldn't. They were just living. I was the one who had fallen out of rhythm with the world. My body screamed for food, but my pride screamed louder. I told myself I'd find a way. Maybe someone needed help carrying boxes, or maybe there'd be day labor work by the docks. But every door I knocked on was the same story. "Sorry, not hiring. Try next week. We've got no openings." By noon, my legs felt heavy, my head light. I sat on a bench in the cold and stared at the people passing by, men in coats, women carrying shopping bags, kids holding their parents' hands. I wanted to stand up and shout, to tell them I wasn't a bad man, just a hungry one. But the words stayed locked inside my throat. I thought about my daughter sitting at home, waiting for me, trusting that her father could fix everything. And that's when something inside me broke. I got up, walked toward a busy intersection, and stood there for what felt like forever. My heart pounded, my mouth dry, my hands shaking. I couldn't do it. The thought of asking a stranger for help felt unbearable. I'd rather starve, I told myself. But then I remembered the sound of her stomach growling in the dark, and my pride lost its argument. I took a breath that felt heavier than any I'd ever taken, and stepped forward. "Excuse me," I said to the first man who passed. He didn't even look at me. "Please, sir." I started again, but he waved his hand, muttering something under his breath as he walked faster. I stood there, frozen, feeling the heat of humiliation burning through the cold air. I tried again with another person, then another, but they all moved past me like I was invisible. Some looked at me with pity, others with disgust, but most just didn't look at all. By the fifth or sixth rejection, my voice began to tremble. "I just need something for my daughter," I said to a woman carrying groceries, but she avoided my eyes, clutching her bag tighter. The words felt strange leaving my mouth, like they didn't belong to me. I had spent my life working hard, earning every dollar with sweat and pride, and now here I was, reduced to pleading for crumbs. As the hours dragged on, my strength drained with every no, every glance that slid past me as if I didn't exist. My pride, the thing I had clung to so stubbornly, shattered piece by piece. I wanted to disappear. And then I heard a small voice behind me. "Daddy?" I turned, and there she was. My daughter. She'd come looking for me. She must have walked all the way from home, her little boots dusted with snow, her cheeks red from the cold. She didn't say anything else. She just walked up to me and slipped her tiny hand into mine. Her fingers were cold but steady, grounding me in a way nothing else could. For a moment, I couldn't move. I wanted to tell her to go home, to hide from what I had become, but the words wouldn't come. She looked up at me with those big, trusting eyes, and suddenly, all the walls I'd built inside myself came crashing down. The next person who passed, I spoke again, my voice barely holding together. "Please," I said, "I just need something to buy my little girl some bread." The man slowed but didn't stop. He gave me the kind of look that cuts deeper than words, the kind that says you don't belong here. I felt my daughter's hand tighten around mine, and in that moment I wanted the earth to swallow me whole. My throat burned, my eyes blurred, and I whispered, "I'm sorry." She didn't respond. She just squeezed my hand again, silently, like she understood everything I couldn't say. Minutes passed, maybe hours, I don't know. The world had gone blurry, distant. And then, finally, a voice broke through. "Hey," someone said softly. I looked up. A man in a brown coat stood in front of us, his face kind but tired. "You okay, buddy?" he asked. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He looked at my daughter, then back at me, and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a crumpled dollar bill and pressed it into my hand. "It's not much," he said, "but maybe it'll help." I tried to thank him, but my voice cracked. He just nodded and walked away. I stared at that dollar like it was gold, like it was proof that the world hadn't completely forgotten how to care. I took my daughter's hand, and together we walked to the nearest bakery. The smell of bread hit me before we even reached the door. Warm, soft, intoxicating. I handed the dollar to the cashier and bought a small loaf, still hot from the oven. We sat on the curb outside, steam rising from the crust as I broke it in half. She looked at me, smiling, and said, "You eat first, Daddy." My throat closed. I shook my head and pushed the bigger piece into her hands. "No, sweetheart," I whispered. "You eat. I'm not hungry." She believed me. Of course she did. She always did. I watched her take the first bite, her eyes closing as if it were the best thing she'd ever tasted. I smiled, even as tears filled my eyes. For that moment, it didn't matter that I'd begged. It didn't matter that my pride was gone. All that mattered was that she wasn't hungry anymore. We walked home quietly after that, her hand still in mine, her head leaning against my arm. She hummed softly, the sound of her voice almost enough to make me forget everything else. When we got home, I tucked her into bed and kissed her forehead, whispering, "Sleep well, my little angel." But as the night settled and I sat in the silence of our small, dimly lit room, I noticed the faint sound of her breathing shift. It was shallower, broken by a soft, dry cough. At first I told myself it was nothing, maybe the cold air from outside, maybe just fatigue. But as the minutes passed, the cough grew harsher, sharper. And that was when the fear returned, cold, heavy, and merciless. Because that night her cough started. Hunger doesn't just starve the stomach. It weakens the soul. It steals the light from your eyes, the strength from your limbs, and the hope from your heart until all that's left is the hollow sound of breathing and the echo of what once was. I learned that truth the day my daughter fell sick. The day I realized hunger wasn't just something we endured. It was something that was slowly breaking us both from the inside out. It started with a cough, soft at first, barely more than a whisper in the dark. I remember sitting on the edge of her bed that night, the flicker of the candle casting long, tired shadows across the walls, listening as she slept. The sound of her breathing, once so steady and calm, had changed. There was a roughness to it now, a faint rasp that made every exhale sound like struggle. I reached out and touched her forehead, and my stomach twisted. She was warm. Too warm. I told myself it was just a cold, just exhaustion from the long days and the cold nights. But deep down, I knew better. Hunger had weakened her. Weeks of thin meals and restless nights had drained the energy from her small body. She'd been quieter lately, her laughter replaced by a dull stillness. The sparkle in her eyes, the one that always lifted me no matter how bad things got, had begun to fade. The next morning she tried to get out of bed, insisting she was fine, but her legs gave out before she could take 2 steps. I caught her just in time, her small body burning with fever in my arms. "It's okay, sweetheart," I said, trying to sound calm, even as fear gripped my throat. "Daddy's here." But inside, my thoughts were chaos. We had no medicine, no money, no food left. I wrapped her in a blanket and held her close, feeling the heat radiating off her skin. She looked up at me with glassy eyes, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm okay, Daddy," she said, forcing a smile that broke my heart. "You don't have to worry." I brushed her hair back from her damp forehead and kissed her temple, wishing I could absorb her pain, take it from her somehow. I told her to rest while I went out to find medicine, though I had no idea how I'd pay for it. The pharmacy was only a few blocks away, but every step there felt like a lifetime. My hands shook as I reached for the door, the small bell above it chiming as I entered. The man behind the counter looked up, his eyes tired and indifferent. "Can I help you?" he asked. "My daughter," I started, my voice catching. "She's sick. She's got a fever and a bad cough. I need something for her, please." He nodded, disappearing into the back, and returned with a small bottle of syrup and a pack of fever tablets. He placed them on the counter, the labels bright and clean, symbols of relief that felt impossibly out of reach. "That'll be $8, he said. $8. It might as well have been 800. I reached into my pockets, my fingers brushing against the few coins I had left. Not even $2 worth. My heart sank. "Please," I whispered. "I'll pay you back. I swear I will. My little girl, she—" He shook his head, his face softening, but his voice firm. "I'm sorry, sir. I can't do that. Store policy." I wanted to beg. I wanted to fall to my knees and plead until he understood. But pride, that stubborn, poisonous pride, still had its claws in me. I nodded, thanked him anyway, and walked out into the cold. The wind hit my face like a slap. and I stood there on the sidewalk, the sound of traffic fading behind me. My little girl was home, burning up, and I had nothing. I wandered the streets aimlessly, my mind racing. There had to be a way. Somewhere between panic and exhaustion, I saw a pawn shop on the corner. The window was cluttered with old guitars, watches, and jackets hanging on a rack by the door. My eyes fell on the coat I was wearing, the last decent piece of clothing I owned, thick enough to keep me warm through the coming winter. Without hesitating, I stepped inside. The man behind the counter barely looked up as I approached. "How much for this?" I asked, pulling off the coat and laying it in front of him. He examined it briefly, then shrugged. $5. "5," I repeated, my voice cracking. "It's worth more than that." He shrugged again. "It's used. Take it or leave it." I took it. The air outside hit me harder this time, biting through my thin shirt as if to punish me for letting go of the one thing that had been keeping me warm. I clutched the crumpled bills in my hand and went back to the pharmacy. The same man looked surprised when I returned, my breath visible in the cold. "I'll take the syrup," I said quietly, placing the money on the counter. He didn't ask questions, just nodded and handed me the bottle. By the time I made it home, my fingers were stiff and numb. I pushed open the door and found her lying there, half asleep, her face flushed, her breathing shallow. I sat beside her and poured the syrup carefully, my hands trembling as I brought the spoon to her lips. "Here, sweetheart," I said softly. "This will help." She opened her eyes just enough to look at me, and in that moment I saw everything: trust, love, innocence, all of it wrapped into one fragile glance. She swallowed the syrup slowly, wincing at the taste. "Thank you, Daddy," she murmured weakly. I smiled, brushing her hair away again, whispering that everything was going to be okay. I told her she'd feel better soon, that the medicine would work, even though I wasn't sure if it would be enough. As the night wore on, her fever rose and fell like a cruel tide. I sat beside her, holding her hand, whispering stories she was too tired to listen to. I talked about the times we went to the park, about her mother, about the stars. I wanted her to stay awake, to keep her here with me, because the silence between her breaths scared me more than anything. At some point, she opened her eyes again, her voice faint but clear enough to pierce through me. "Daddy," she said. "You didn't eat again, did you?" The question hit me harder than any blow could. My heart twisted painfully, my breath catching in my chest. I looked at her. So small, so fragile, yet somehow still worrying about me when she could barely keep her eyes open. I forced a smile, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I lied. "I ate earlier." But she didn't look convinced. She gave a tiny nod, her eyelids fluttering as she drifted back into sleep, her small hand still gripping my fingers. I sat there long after she'd fallen asleep, staring at her, feeling the weight of that question sink deep into me. It wasn't just about food. It was about everything: the lies, the failures, the helplessness. Hunger I could endure. Cold I could survive. But watching her suffer, watching her body fight for warmth and strength that I couldn't give her, that was unbearable. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break something, to rage at the world that had taken everything from us. But instead, I sat there in silence, tears streaming down my face, my hands trembling as I held hers tighter. And as I watched her sleep, her breathing uneven, her small chest rising and falling under the threadbare blanket, I realized something inside me had begun to break too. Something deeper than pride. Something I didn't know how to fix. That question ripped something open inside me. When your child worries about your hunger, you realize who the real adult is. It's the kind of moment that shifts something inside you forever. When you see your reflection not through the mirror, but through your child's eyes, and you no longer recognize the man looking back. That morning, her fever had eased a little, though the cough still clung to her chest like something determined to stay. I woke to the faint sound of her voice calling my name, soft and tired, like a melody played too quietly to hear clearly. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice weak but gentle. "Did you eat today?" For a second, I thought I'd imagined it. I turned toward her and saw those same wide eyes staring at me, still full of love, but with a new kind of understanding I hadn't seen before. It scared me more than anything else. I smiled, or at least tried to, though I could feel the muscles in my face trembling from exhaustion. "Of course I did, sweetheart," I said, my voice light, almost playful. "Daddy's fine. You just worry about feeling better, okay?" But she didn't look away this time. She just kept staring at me, her little brows furrowed, as if she was studying every corner of my expression. "You didn't," she said softly, her voice shaking. "You haven't eaten in days." My chest tightened, the lie I'd told so many times catching in my throat. I wanted to laugh it off, to make a joke, to shift her attention somewhere else, anywhere else. But she was no longer the little girl who believed every word I said without question. She was sick, weak, but sharper than I'd ever realized. "Sweetheart," I said, forcing a chuckle, "why would you think that? Look at me. I'm strong as ever." I flexed my arm, pretending to be silly. But she didn't smile. She didn't even blink. Her eyes shimmered with tears that she was too proud to let fall. "I heard your stomach last night," she whispered, her voice breaking. "When I woke up, you were sitting there, and it was growling really loud. You said you were fine, but I heard it, Daddy." Her words hit harder than any hunger ever could. I turned away, pretending to adjust the blanket, trying to hide the sting in my eyes. "It's nothing, sweetheart," I murmured, my voice thin. "Sometimes grown-ups just don't feel hungry. It's not a big deal." But even as I said it, I could feel the weight of my lie pressing down on me. Because it was a big deal, not the hunger itself, but what it represented. Every time I told her I'd eaten, every time I smiled through the emptiness in my stomach, I thought I was protecting her. But all I'd really done was teach her how to carry a pain no child should ever know, the pain of worrying for a parent. Her small hand reached out and caught mine. Her fingers were frail and trembling, but her grip was firm. "Please, Daddy," she said. "Don't lie to me anymore." I froze. My throat burned, my heart pounding so hard it felt like the sound might fill the room. I wanted to tell her the truth, but how do you explain desperation to a child? How do you tell the one person you're supposed to protect that you can't even protect yourself? I looked into her eyes, and for the first time, I saw that she wasn't just a little girl anymore. Hunger had taken pieces of her childhood and replaced them with understanding. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. I didn't want you to worry." Her tears finally fell then, soft and silent, rolling down her pale cheeks. "I always worry," she said. "I can tell when you're lying. You say you're fine, but you look tired all the time. You don't eat, you don't sleep. You just sit and look sad when you think I'm not watching." I felt my composure crack completely. Every ounce of strength I'd tried to hold on to shattered under the weight of her words. I turned away for a moment, pressing my palms to my eyes, but it didn't stop the tears. "I'm trying," I said, barely able to get the words out. "I swear I'm trying. My voice faltered. I don't know what else to do anymore." When I turned back, she was sitting up slightly, her hair sticking to her forehead, her breathing uneven. She reached for the small piece of bread left from the day before, the one I'd saved for her. She tore it in half and held it out to me. "You eat," she said softly. "Please, Daddy, I'm not hungry." I wanted to refuse. I wanted to tell her no, to remind her that I was the parent, that she was the one who needed to eat. But the way she looked at me, pleading, insistent, made it impossible. I took the bread from her trembling hands, feeling its rough texture against my skin. My throat tightened as I looked down at it. It was such a small thing, just a scrap of food, but in her eyes it was everything. I broke it in two again, smaller pieces this time, and gave half back to her. "We'll share," I said. She smiled weakly, as if the act itself gave her relief. We ate together in silence, chewing slowly, letting each bite linger as long as possible, as if stretching it could fill the space that hunger had carved between us. When we finished, she leaned against me, her head resting on my chest, her breathing still shallow but steady. I could feel her heartbeat through the thin fabric of her nightshirt, fragile, yet determined. "Promise me something, Daddy," she said after a while, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anything," I said. "Promise me you'll eat. Even if there's only a little bit, you'll eat too." I closed my eyes. The promise felt heavier than it should have. "I promise," I whispered, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I could keep them. Because in my heart, I knew, if it came down to it again, if there was only enough for one of us, I'd still give it to her. I always would. She smiled then, her small hand finding mine again. "Good," she murmured, her voice fading. "Then we'll both be okay." I held her close as she drifted back into sleep, her face soft, her breathing uneven but calmer. I stared at her for what felt like hours, my hand gently stroking her hair. The guilt that had been living inside me for weeks grew unbearable, a physical ache that pressed against my ribs until I could hardly breathe. I wanted to believe that things would get better, that this storm would pass. But the walls around us told a different story. The cracked paint, the cold air seeping through the windows, the emptiness in every corner of that room. That night, I sat by her bedside long after the candle burned out, the darkness settling heavy and cold. I looked at her small, fragile body curled beneath the blanket, and realized I had nothing left to give except prayers. I'd never been much of a praying man. Life had taught me to rely on my hands, not on hope. But that night, I broke. I knelt beside her bed, my hands clasped tightly, and whispered into the darkness. "Please," I said softly, not even sure who I was talking to. "Please don't take her from me. I'll do anything. Just let her get better. Let me find a way." The words came out uneven, torn between fear and faith. For the first time in years, I cried without shame, without holding back, my tears falling onto the wooden floor. I prayed for food. I prayed for strength. But mostly, I prayed for a miracle, one that could save her, and maybe, in some small way, save me too. That was the night I prayed for, a miracle. Help sometimes comes from the places you least expect. Sometimes it arrives quietly, without announcement or grandeur, like a whisper in a storm, just when you've convinced yourself that no one in the world sees you anymore. The morning after I prayed for a miracle, I woke to the faint sound of my daughter coughing again. It was weaker than before, but still there, a reminder that the fever hadn't completely released its grip. The light coming through the window was pale and cold, and the chill in the room felt sharper than usual. I sat beside her bed, brushing her hair from her face, trying to pretend I wasn't terrified that things might get worse before they got better. She opened her eyes and gave me a small, tired smile. "Daddy," she whispered, "did you find work yet?" I forced a smile in return, the lie already forming on my tongue before I could stop it. "Almost," I said softly. "I think something good's coming soon." It was all I could give her. Hope, even if it was only made of air. When she fell back asleep, I quietly slipped on my shoes and stepped outside. The morning air bit at my face as if the world was scolding me for daring to hope. My pockets were empty, my stomach hollow, and my pride hanging by a thread. I didn't know where to go or what to do. I only knew I couldn't sit in that cold room any longer, listening to her cough and feeling useless. I wandered toward the edge of the neighborhood where the old corner store stood, a small place I used to visit after work when life was still kind. The shopkeeper, Mr. Harris, was a man I'd known for years. He was quiet, the kind of man who didn't talk much but noticed everything. I hadn't seen him since the day I lost my job. I didn't plan to go inside, but something about the smell of baked bread drifting from his shop pulled me closer. Through the window, I saw him stocking shelves, his movements slow and deliberate. The bell above the door jingled when I stepped in, and for a moment, I thought about turning back. But then he looked up and smiled. That same easy, genuine smile that made you feel like you weren't a stranger, even if you hadn't spoken in months. "Well, I'll be," he said. "Haven't seen you in a while, son. How have you been?" I hesitated, forcing another smile. "Just busy," I said, the lie sounding as thin as it felt. He nodded, studying me in that quiet way of his. "And how's your little girl? I remember she used to love those peanut butter crackers we sell here." The mention of her made my chest ache. She's okay," I managed. "A little under the weather." Mr. Harris nodded again, but there was something in his eyes, an understanding that went beyond what I was saying. He looked at me for a long moment before glancing toward the back of the store. "Wait here a minute," he said, and disappeared behind the counter. I stood there awkwardly, staring at the rows of food I couldn't afford, loaves of bread, cans of soup, fruit. Things that once seemed ordinary now looked like treasures. He returned carrying a small brown bag. "Here," he said, setting it gently on the counter. "A few things for you and your girl. Bread, milk, soup. Nothing fancy." My instinct kicked in immediately. I shook my head. "I can't take that," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. "I don't have money right now. Maybe later when I—" He raised a hand, stopping me mid-sentence. "It's not charity," he said calmly. "Consider it a loan if that makes it easier." "I can't—" I started again, but he cut me off with a quiet firmness that left no room for argument. "Let her eat," he said, his voice steady and gentle. "You've done enough." The words hit me harder than any pity ever could. I stood there, staring at him, unable to speak. There was no judgment in his eyes, no trace of condescension, just simple human kindness. And somehow, that made it even harder to accept. My pride and my gratitude wrestled inside me like two animals locked in battle. Part of me wanted to drop to my knees and thank him. The other part wanted to run out of the store, hide my shame somewhere it couldn't be seen. He must have seen the conflict in my face because he added, "You're not the first man to go through hard times, and you won't be the last. Take it home, son. Feed your girl. You can pay me back when the good days return." My throat tightened. I nodded slowly, unable to meet his eyes, and reached for the bag. The weight of it in my hands felt heavier than it should have, not because of what was inside, but because of what it meant. It wasn't just food, it was mercy, it was hope. I mumbled my thanks, barely managing the words, and turned to leave. "Tell her I said to get better soon," he called after me. I nodded without looking back, stepping into the cold with tears stinging my eyes. The walk home felt different this time. The world didn't look any brighter, but the ache in my chest had softened just enough to let me breathe. The bag pressed against my side with each step, its warmth seeping through the paper like a quiet promise. When I reached the door, I paused for a moment, staring at it, gathering myself before going inside. My daughter was still lying in bed when I walked in, her eyes fluttering open as she heard my footsteps. "Daddy?" she said softly. "Did you find something?" I smiled, a real one, for the first time in what felt like forever, and held up the bag. "I did, sweetheart," I said. "Look what we've got." Her face lit up with a joy that melted the cold straight out of the air. I set the food on the table and began unpacking it. The loaf of bread, the can of soup, a small carton of milk. To anyone else it would have been a modest meal, but to us it was a feast. I warmed the soup on the stove, the smell filling the room like comfort itself. She watched me, smiling, her cheeks still pale but her eyes brighter. When I handed her the bowl, she looked at me for a long moment before saying softly, "You didn't have to go far, did you?" I shook my head. "No, sweetheart, just far enough." We ate together that night, slowly, quietly. Every spoonful felt like a blessing. She laughed between bites, saying the soup tasted better than anything she remembered. I didn't tell her that I hadn't eaten any of it, that I was saving my share for later. For now, it was enough just to watch her eat, to see life return to her face, even if only a little. When she finished, she leaned against me, her small body warm and soft. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. "Thank you for finding food." I held her close, my hand gently stroking her hair, my eyes staring at the flickering candlelight on the wall. I thought about Mr. Harris, about the simple kindness that had changed everything in a single moment. It wasn't grand, it wasn't loud, but it was exactly what we needed. That night, as my daughter slept peacefully for the first time in days, I sat awake by the window, looking out at the quiet street below. The world still felt uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel completely alone. There were still good people out there, people who saw others not as burdens, but as human beings. And yet, as I sat there, letting the quiet settle around me, something inside whispered that this wasn't the end of our story. Because kindness, I would soon learn, carries its own story, one that can change a life in ways you never see coming. But I didn't know that kindness had a story of its own. Every act of kindness demands a piece of your humility. That's something I never truly understood until the day I swallowed what little pride I had left and let someone help me rebuild what hunger and hardship had broken. After Mr. Harris gave us that bag of food, something in me shifted. It wasn't a miracle, but it was enough to remind me that survival didn't always come from strength. Sometimes it came from surrender. The morning after that small mercy, the world didn't look brighter, but it felt lighter somehow. My daughter's fever had gone down, her laughter, faint and careful, returned like a ghost that had been waiting at the door. She was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing again, her crayons spread out beside her like tiny fragments of color in a world that had gone gray. She looked up at me and grinned. "You should smile more, Daddy," she said, her voice still weak but full of that same simple joy I'd missed so much. "When you smile, it makes the room warmer." I laughed softly, though the sound still felt strange in my throat. "Maybe the room's just warmer because you're in it," I said. She rolled her eyes playfully, the way only children can, and went back to her drawing. For the first time in weeks, the air in our home didn't feel so heavy. Later that day, I went back to Mr. Harris's store to thank him properly. The walk there was easier this time, my steps less burdened by shame. When I entered, he looked up from the counter and gave me that same calm nod. "Morning, son," he said, as if nothing unusual had ever passed between us. "Morning," I replied, my voice a little steadier than before. "I just wanted to say thank you for yesterday." He waved a hand dismissively. "You don't owe me thanks. You needed a hand, I had one to give. That's how the world should work, isn't it?" I nodded, unsure how to respond. Before I could say anything else, he reached under the counter and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Actually," he said, "I've been thinking. You said you were looking for work. Well, I could use some help around here. Stocking shelves, unloading deliveries, cleaning up after hours. It's not much, but it's something." For a moment, I just stood there, stunned. The offer hung in the air like a lifeline, but so did the weight of my pride. My first instinct was to refuse, to tell him he'd already done enough, that I couldn't take any more. My mouth opened to say it, but the words wouldn't come. I saw my reflection in the glass door of the refrigerator beside me. Hollow eyes, tired face, hands rough from work long gone. Pride had done nothing but starve me. Pride had kept my child hungry. "Are you sure?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "Positive. It's not charity, son. I'll pay you by the hour. You can start today if you want." Something broke loose inside me then, not in a painful way, but in a way that felt like release. I nodded. "Thank you," I said, the words thick with emotion. You don't know what this means?" He smiled faintly. "Sure I do. I've been there." Those 4 words hit me harder than anything else he'd said. I wanted to ask what he meant, but his eyes told me enough. A quiet understanding born from experience. That afternoon, I started working. The tasks were simple: stacking boxes, sweeping floors, sorting inventory. But each one felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. My body ached, but the ache was different now. It wasn't hunger. It was effort, purpose. For the first time in months, I came home with more than empty hands. When I opened the door, my daughter was sitting on the floor, surrounded by her crayons and a dozen new drawings. She looked up and saw the small bag of groceries in my hand. Her face lit up like sunlight breaking through clouds. "You got food again?" she shouted, running to me. "Does that mean you found work?" I knelt down and smiled. "Yeah," I said, trying not to let my voice shake. "Mr. Harris needs some help at his store, and he's letting me work for him." Her eyes widened with excitement. "So you're not sad anymore?" I laughed softly. "Not as much as before." She threw her arms around my neck and hugged me tight. "I told you a miracle would happen," she whispered. And maybe she was right. Maybe miracles didn't come as lightning bolts from the sky or angels at your door. Maybe they came as quiet men behind dusty counters, offering a chance when no one else would. The following days moved differently. The routine of work brought rhythm back into my life. I'd wake early, make sure my daughter was warm and fed, then walk to the store as the sun rose. Mr. Harris never asked questions about my situation, and I never offered explanations. There was an unspoken respect between us, one that came from knowing the delicate balance between pride and gratitude. The first time he handed me pay for the week, a few bills folded neatly in an envelope. I held it like it was made of glass. "It's honest work," he said simply. "You earned it." That night I brought home a small chicken and a bag of potatoes. It wasn't much, but it felt like victory. My daughter helped me cook, her laughter echoing through the kitchen as she stirred the pot, making a mess I didn't even mind cleaning up. When we finally sat down to eat, she clasped her hands together and said, "We should say thank you." "To who?" I asked, smiling. She grinned. "To whoever made today good." So we did. Not in any formal way, not in the way church folks do, but quietly, with full hearts. And for the first time in what felt like forever, we both ate until we were full. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, life began to rebuild itself, piece by fragile piece. The dark circles under her eyes faded, replaced by the color of life returning. Her laughter grew louder, her energy stronger. Sometimes she'd stop by the store after school, bursting through the door with stories about her day, and Mr. Harris would chuckle softly, pretending to scold her for interrupting while secretly enjoying every word. One evening, after closing, I stayed behind to help him finish restocking. The store was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath our feet. As we worked, he looked over and said, "You know, you remind me of myself a long time ago." I paused, curious. "Yeah?" He nodded slowly. "Years back, I lost everything. My wife, my home, my job. I ended up sleeping in my car for months. People walked past me like I didn't exist. Then one day, a stranger handed me a sandwich and said, 'You'll get through this.' It wasn't the food that saved me. It was the reminder that I mattered. Sometimes that's all it takes." I didn't say anything for a long time. My throat felt tight again, the same way it did when my daughter thanked me for the smallest things. I realized then that kindness doesn't just feed you, it humbles you. It reminds you that you're human. When I got home that night, my daughter was already asleep, her arm draped over her, stuffed bare, her breathing soft and even. I stood there for a while, watching her, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. I looked around our small home, the one that had felt like a cage of worry for so long, and realized it had become something else again, a place of warmth, however fragile. For the first time in months, I believed we were going to be okay. But life wasn't done testing me yet. For the first time in months, I didn't sleep hungry. But not for the reason you think. Hunger doesn't only live in your stomach. Sometimes it settles in your heart. And even when your body is fed, it lingers like a ghost that refuses to leave. The day I realized that was the day I understood that some kinds of emptiness can't be filled with food. Life had finally started to look like something I could recognize again. The cold that used to creep under our door had softened into warmth. The once empty shelves in our kitchen now held more than just shadows. There were cans of soup, a bag of flour, even a few apples that my daughter loved so much. The house smelled of cooking again, the kind of smell that seeps into the walls and reminds you that you're still alive, still fighting. Every morning, I left early for the store, and every evening, I came home to the sight of her sitting by the window, crayons scattered around, her smile waiting for me like a light I could follow home. She was stronger now, her cheeks no longer pale, her laughter ringing through the house like it used to. Watching her heal felt like watching spring bloom after a long, merciless winter. I'd catch her humming to herself while drawing, little songs she used to sing before things fell apart. Sometimes, she'd come to me with her drawings. Pictures of us, smiling, standing in front of our home, the sun beaming above. She'd always draw a loaf of bread on the table, as if to remind me that the simplest things were now our greatest treasures. Work at the store was steady. My hands were rough again, my back sore, but every ache felt like proof that I was earning our survival piece by piece. Mr. Harris treated me like family. Some days he'd hand me a sandwich for lunch and pretend it was just extra stock. Other times, he'd press a few dollars more into my pay and say, just a rounding error, even though we both knew better. I tried to repay his kindness the only way I knew how, by showing up, working hard, and never taking his mercy for granted. One evening, after closing, I was sweeping the floor when he said something that stayed with me. "You've done good, son," he said quietly, stacking boxes near the counter. "Don't ever let the world make you believe you're less just because you fell once. What matters is that you stood back up." Those words sank deep into me, heavier than the day's exhaustion. Because standing back up, that's what it had all been about. Every tear, every lie, every sleepless night had been part of that climb back to my feet. And now, with a roof over our heads, food in our home, and laughter echoing through the walls again, I finally felt like maybe I'd kept my promise. To her mother, and to myself. That night, I made dinner. Real dinner. Potatoes roasted in butter, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, and a small piece of chicken. I didn't have to pretend anymore. I didn't have to smile through hunger or lie about being full. I sat across from my daughter, and as she took her first bite, I felt something loosen in my chest, a release, a quiet exhale of months of fear. She looked up at me and grinned. "This is the best meal ever," she said, her voice light, full of joy. I laughed and nodded, watching her eat, memorizing the sight of her face glowing in the candlelight. When I finally ate, I savored every bite. The food was simple, but it tasted like victory. Each spoonful carried the weight of every moment we had survived, the nights of emptiness, the prayers whispered into darkness, the humiliations swallowed whole. I ate until I was full, and when I leaned back in my chair, I realized something strange. The ache in my stomach was gone, but the ache in my heart remained. Because even now, when we had enough to eat, I couldn't forget what it felt like not to. The memory of hunger clings to you. It changes the way you see everything. I found myself saving scraps of food, setting aside small portions, just in case. I caught myself flinching whenever I saw the bottom of a bag of flour or the last piece of bread. I still couldn't shake the sound of her stomach growling in the dark, or the look in her eyes when she'd asked if I'd eaten. That night, after she went to bed, I sat by the window, looking out at the quiet street below. The moonlight spilled across the kitchen table, illuminating the plate still holding crumbs from dinner. I thought about all the nights I'd sat there, empty-handed, staring into the dark and wondering if we'd make it to morning. I thought about the man I used to be, proud, stubborn, and blind to the small mercies that keep us alive. And I thought about the people who had carried me when I couldn't carry myself. Mr. Harris, the stranger who had handed me $1, and, above all, my daughter, whose faith in me never wavered even when mine did. It struck me then how love, not strength, had been our salvation. It wasn't my endurance or my pride that had saved us. It was her laughter in the face of hunger, her drawings of better days, her small hands offering me half a piece of bread. It was the way she made me believe, even when I couldn't see a reason to. When I finally went to bed that night, I lay beside her, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. The room was warm, the cupboards were full, and for the first time in months, there was no emptiness gnawing at me. Yet, as I drifted toward sleep, I felt a quiet hunger still, lingering, not in my stomach, but in the space where fear and gratitude meet. It wasn't a hunger for food anymore. It was a hunger to do more, to be more, to never let her face that kind of pain again. I realized that hunger changes you forever. It teaches you humility in ways comfort never can. It strips you bare and forces you to see what truly matters. It teaches you that pride can't feed a child, that kindness is worth more than gold, and that love, pure, desperate, selfless love, is the only thing that survives when everything else is gone. As I closed my eyes, I whispered a quiet prayer, not of desperation this time, but of gratitude, for survival, for second chances, for the warmth of a home that almost wasn't. I thought about my wife and hoped she could see us, that she'd be proud of the man I'd become, flawed and broken, but still trying. The next morning, I woke to sunlight pouring through the window and the sound of her humming in the kitchen. It was the sound of life, of renewal, of peace. For the first time in months, hunger, that cruel, restless thing, had finally fallen asleep inside me. But years later, she'd remind me of that hunger, in a way I never expected. The most precious meal I ever had wasn't about food. It was about love. Years have passed since those long, empty nights, and sometimes when I look back, it feels like they belonged to another life entirely. A life lived by a man I barely recognize, but still carry inside me. My daughter is grown now, her laughter richer, her voice stronger, her spirit just as bright as the little girl who once drew pictures of bread and soup and called them dream dinners. She has her own home now, her own world, one she built with the same fierce determination that once kept us alive. And yet, even now, every time I hear her call me Dad, I feel the same ache of pride I did when she was small, an ache made of love, gratitude, and memory. The years softened the hunger, but never erased it. Some nights, when the world grows quiet, I still catch myself saving bits of food, wrapping leftovers carefully, tucking them away as if the next famine might be waiting just beyond tomorrow. Old habits are hard to kill, especially the ones born from survival. But these days, the hunger that lingers in me isn't for bread or warmth. It's for moments, for connection, for the people who made those hard years worth enduring. It was a Friday evening when she called. Her voice was bright, warm, the kind of tone she used when she was planning something. "Dad," she said, "don't make dinner tonight. I'm coming over. I've got a surprise." I smiled, leaning back in my chair, the years melting away in her excitement. "A surprise, huh? I thought you were too busy saving the world with that big job of yours." "Even heroes have time for dinner," she teased. "Just be ready at 7. When she hung up, I sat there for a while, staring at the phone in my hand, a strange mix of joy and nostalgia washing over me. It had been years since she'd surprised me with anything, and though I didn't know what to expect, part of me already knew. She was her mother's daughter after all, and every act of love she gave carried that same quiet thoughtfulness. The evening came slowly, the light outside fading into gold, then blue. I tidied the house, something to keep my hands busy, though everything was already in its place. When the clock struck 7, I heard her car pull up, followed by the soft rhythm of footsteps on the porch. I opened the door before she could knock. She stood there with a grin, holding 2 large bags that smelled of warmth and comfort. "Hey, old man," she said playfully, stepping inside. "Hope you're hungry." I laughed. "You have no idea." She unpacked the bags on the table, and the smell that filled the air nearly brought me to tears. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and even a small apple pie. It was a feast, far beyond what I'd ever expect her to bring. "You didn't have to do all this," I said, my voice catching. "I wanted to," she said softly, looking at me in a way that made my chest tighten. "Do you remember when I used to draw dinners for us? Pancakes, spaghetti, all that stuff?" I nodded slowly, my throat tightening. "I remember everyone." "Well," she said, smiling through glistening eyes, "I thought it was time you got the real version." I couldn't speak. I just sat down, watching her move around the kitchen, setting the table like she used to watch me do when she was small. She poured 2 glasses of water, sliced the bread, and placed the food carefully in front of me. Every motion carried something unspoken, a memory, a thank you, a kind of reverence that words couldn't hold. We ate together, laughing between bites, sharing stories that drifted between the past and present. She told me about her job, her friends, the things she wanted to do. I listened, nodding, proud beyond words. But beneath the laughter, I could feel something heavier, an emotion that neither of us wanted to touch yet. After we finished eating, she grew quiet. Her fingers traced the rim of her glass as she said, almost hesitantly, "You know, Dad, I remember more than you think." I looked at her, unsure what she meant. She smiled sadly, her voice gentle but steady. "The nights you didn't eat, the way you used to sit beside me and say you were full, the stories you told to distract me when I asked why you weren't having dinner too. I knew, even then. Maybe not completely, but I knew." Her words pierced through me, slow and deep. I tried to speak, to explain, but the lump in my throat made it impossible. She reached across the table and took my hand, her touch warm, grounding. "You did everything for me, Dad. Everything. And I want you to know, I never forgot." I felt the tears before I could stop them. They came quietly, the kind that build slowly until they can't be held back anymore. "I didn't want you to see," I whispered. "You were just a little girl. You shouldn't have had to remember that." She squeezed my hand, smiling through her own tears. "But I did. And I'm glad I did, because it taught me what love really looks like." I had no answer, no words that could measure the weight of that moment. All I could do was sit there, watching her, my little girl, no longer little, and realize that every sacrifice, every lie, every hungry night had led us to this table, to this meal, to this moment of quiet redemption. When she stood, she walked around to me, leaned down, and kissed the top of my head. "Now," she said softly, "you finish your food. You always made sure I ate first. It's your turn." I laughed through the tears, shaking my head, but she placed the plate back in front of me, her tone playfully firm. "No arguments, Dad. Tonight, you eat." So I did. And as I took that first bite, something inside me broke open, not from sadness, but from gratitude so deep it hurt. I tasted more than food. I tasted time, memory, forgiveness. Every flavor carried a story, every bite a reflection of what we had survived. For the first time in my life, I ate without guilt, without fear, without hunger chasing me from the inside. When we finished, we sat together in silence, the kind that feels full, not empty. The candle flickered between us, and I watched her smile in that soft, familiar way that once belonged to her mother. That night, as she hugged me goodbye at the door, she said, "You always told me love means giving up what you have so someone else can have more. You were right. But tonight, it was my turn." After she left, I sat alone at the table, the plates still warm, the scent of roasted chicken still hanging in the air. I closed my eyes and let the tears fall freely. She fed me that night, and fed the hunger in my soul. As I leaned back in my chair, I thought of all the nights that had brought me here, the nights of empty plates and quiet lies, the nights of prayer and trembling hope. Love, I realized, had been the constant thread through it all, a love that asked for nothing but gave everything. And as the candle burned low, I whispered into the silence, my voice soft and certain. Sometimes love means going hungry, so someone else can be full. The house grew quiet, the kind of quiet that feels sacred. I looked toward the window where the moonlight spilled through the glass, and for a moment I could almost see her mother's reflection beside mine, smiling, proud, at peace. And though the hunger was long gone, I knew that its lesson, the love it taught, the humility it carved, the faith it forged, would live forever. If this story stirred something in your heart, let me know in the comments. Tell me, who would you go hungry for? Hit that like button and subscribe, because more stories like this one are waiting to remind you what love truly means.